Welcome to the Australian Institute of Architects. My name's Michael Linke and I'm the General Manager of Membership here in Melbourne. And thanks very much for joining us at this critically important session on interacting with clients and community after trauma. These sessions constitute part of our response to the unprecedented recent bushfires which we've seen affect Australia. But what is emerging is the fact that they're equally applicable to other situations we're currently facing, including the significant disruption that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on our society. So whether it's bushfires or whether it's COVID-19, none of us are immune to the devastating impact that this is having across Australia and the world. This seminar forms a set within the Building Back Better series, recently held in Sydney. So these sessions address interpersonal communications and process management between the architect and the client after a traumatic event. It also explores how disasters disrupt many aspects of community life, warping individual perspectives and our collective needs. So the main themes to be covered today are the effects of trauma on the mind, the characteristics of continuing stress and anxiety, how to recognise and interact with someone in a state of high arousal, how architects may be best helped to help communities recover after disasters and how it differs from daily normal circumstances, and personal qualities to help communities recover. And that's what we'll be covering in today's sessions. We're very pleased to have two leading experts in this area today. We're pleased to have Jenny Donovan with us. Jenny is the Principal of Melbourne Urban Design Practice Inclusive Design, Sessional International Expert in Placemaking for UN Habitat, and a Sessional Lecturer at La Trobe University. Jenny's work focuses on creating places that facilitate people to meet their needs, to thrive and to fulfil their potential. Jenny's work spans urban and landscape design and neighbourhood renewal in countries like Australia, the United Kingdom and Ireland, and post-conflict and post-disaster reconstruction in Montenegro, Palestine, Ireland, Ethiopia, Kosovo and Sri Lanka. Jenny's book, Designing to Heal, is now available through the CSIRO. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jenny Donovan.
Thank you, Michael. Michael is absolutely correct when he says that there are many principles which are common to all disasters, but equally, no one disaster is identical to another disaster. As to paraphrase Trevor Budge, once you've seen one disaster, you've seen one disaster. And what I'd like to do today is to share with you some ideas that may or may not be appropriate, but were appropriate, and I leave it to you to consider their applicability to whatever situation you might be covering, and in light of the present crisis to consider its relevance for COVID-19. I will be making some observations about COVID-19, but in keeping with my brief, I'm going to cover a wider range of issues surrounding disaster, and in keeping with my experience, typically dealing with disasters that have involved physical destruction. So what I'd like to do today is to share some observations about what happens to a community when a disaster happens, how architects, urban designers, landscape architects and allied professionals can help people to go through their own paths of recovery. We can't make it happen, we can just make the path clearer for them. And what I hope will be a strong emphasis to this presentation is I hope if we do our job well, we can nurture hope. And hope is a very important commodity. Hope is a motivation that can keep people going. So, first of all, what is a disaster? A disaster has many definitions, one of which I've amended slightly from compiling a range of disasters, and I find is a helpful definition, is a disaster is a major disruption to multiple aspects of community life that exceed the community's or society's ability to cope using its own resources. In other words, it needs outside help. So, to look at what happens to a community that befalls a disaster, there's loss of life and property, like I say, particularly in the disasters I've previously dealt with. But as well as that, a whole other layer of society unravels when disasters happen. people lose their livelihood, their sense of independence, their sense of self-determination, of purpose. There's often a loss of utility, social health support infrastructure, the things that people demand and need to keep their lives, the foundations of their lives, become unavailable to them. Now, if this was to happen to you individually, say you had a car crash, it wasn't a disaster as such, you can call on the whole of society, you can call on your friends, you can call on healthcare, you can call on a whole range of informal social services, let's say, to help you recover. But when your friends, your family, and those social services are also disrupted, then you can't call on them, and it amplifies the impact it has on people. As we'll hear later, one of the significant things that this does is this unravels the emotional wiring in people, and we come to trauma, which you'll hear more about later, and post-traumatic stress disorder, where the load on our body of the stress of the trauma causes our allostatic load to be greater than our bodies can deal with, and we have physical, emotional, and mental implications of that. And an important aspect of the impacts of a disaster is a term that's been described as solastalgia. Solastalgia is a term that was defined by philosopher Glenn Albrecht. This is the sense that's been best described as homesickness felt at home, when you are separated from the place that you love, not by distance, but by time. And that time of each passing moment gets further and further, and there's nothing you can do about it. The place that you love, the place that mattered to you, is receding into the past and into the distance. And this can have profound impacts on people. I spoke to people after a range of disasters and was powerfully moved by their description of this being slowly rent, slowly torn away from what was important to them. When this happens, places that it happened become tainted. They acquire a bad, they promote a bad emotional response. The places that were the foundations of communities are no longer able to facilitate, to meet those needs, to facilitate those experiences. And when that happens, there's an erosion of the connection between people and place. I heard this particularly in Christchurch after the earthquake there, where it was the churches and the pubs, the older buildings, that were particularly badly destroyed. And in a town like Christchurch, quite conservative in many ways, these were the hubs of community, and these were the places that were most severely damaged. And by the very nature of disasters, most of us are not used to them. And when they happen, people are off the map on a very unfamiliar emotional journey. And this leads to the erosion of community and all those sorts of things that gave us the foundation of the links, the bonds between people that helped them through day-to-day life becomes much more harder. We have to call much more on our own ability to deal with these problems. And for a lot of us, we just don't have the resilience to do that. But as architects, as urban designers, we need to be aware that this is the journey the people that we're working with are going on. A quote from Rob Kerr in a council I still can't pronounce, just north of Christchurch, who was a planner there, that he told me, I thought really summed up well. When he was looking at the aftermath of the Canterbury earthquakes in 2010-2011, he said fixing the roads and bridges will be the easy bit. He recognised that this social unravelling and the tainting of place, the social landscape, was more significant and a bigger problem than the damage to the physical landscape. So, to express this graphically, what happens when you have a disaster is there is a denial of the foundations of people's lives. If you can imagine the situation illustrated on the screen, in our day-to-day life, in our normal life, we can call on things that we can rely on, and these things help us to strive for a sense of well-being, for a sense of moving towards happiness. And those things that we have, they're reliable and we know that they're there, and it just means that the gap between where we want to be and where we are is relatively short. It gives us something that we can strive for, that's realistic thing to try and achieve. And there's a relatively small livability deficit, the deficit that we're all trying to find in our day-to-day lives, what keeps us going and makes the challenges of life bite-sized and gives us the chance to hope that we can achieve that sense of well-being. However, after a disaster, we lose many of those things, and that livability deficit becomes much bigger. For many people, it seems like an impossible chasm to try and overcome. When this happens, if it happens at all, it happens despite people's surroundings. People's surroundings no longer facilitate their well-being. This leads to what I call the high cost of living. And I don't mean anything to do with inflation. I mean, if you're a survivor, you have to face a whole range of challenges you never had to face before. There's obviously the most visual sign, the rebuilding of the physical infrastructure. But then again, there's a rebuilding of the social infrastructure, and the people that were in it, that were the hubs of our social infrastructure, may be dead, may be overwhelmed, maybe not be able to exist in the present circumstances to do what they used to do for us and with us. We have to deal with personal and communal loss. There is the important job of respecting the victim and survivors, to acknowledging what they've been through. Quite often, there is the question of recovering a scattered community. One of the things that I became aware of in Christchurch and in Kosovo in particular was that after the conflict, the progression was worse. People became more mired in the damage as they saw the community diminishing, as people were leaving and continued to leave. And this meant that the bottom point became more obscured, became further away, and didn't allow them to sort of look at a time of moving forward for quite a while after that. Old skills and sources of self-esteem become irrelevant. The things that you did before may not be available in the future. And a lifetime of achievement can seem wasted. I heard some very sad stories of people after the bushfires who had spent 30 years paying off a mortgage and had a house that they were proud of, that expressed themselves, that was their house. They had perhaps 10 years of working life left, and they couldn't see how they could ever get back to where they were before. In these circumstances, hope is very difficult to maintain, and if hope goes, people give up. Hope is a motivation that makes it worthwhile for people to invest in trying to make things better. If they have no hope, they just don't, more likely to not bother. An important point of this is that these effects will echo through lives for a very long time. When you have a situation, in the normal situation, day-to-day life presents challenges, but those challenges are, for most people, easy to overcome or at least meet, and life can go on. After disasters, those challenges become much greater, and the chances of meeting, or our ability to meet those challenges, become much less. And for some people, become impossible. But I'd like to acknowledge, in all the projects I've worked in, I have been amazed, quite overwhelmed often, in the resilience of people and the ability of people to find a way to deal with their loss, whether this be through humour or through sort of people finding ways to try and reassure one another. This, I don't know if it's clear, but this says, and this is near where I live in Albert Park, and someone had painted on a window, "There will be bad days and there will be good days, stay safe." And it was just a message of hope that someone had given, just broadcast to the wider community. So how can we ensure that this recovery is nurtured? And I use the word recovery here, and we'll be hearing later that perhaps it is maybe not the right word, and that's something perhaps we can discuss. I'd like to say that we can be part of a process of designing to heal, in that we can create places that are hardwired to help people go through their own process of recovery and reforge social bonds to get back on track. And one of the things to be aware of is when disasters happen, they not just destroy the sources of well-being, but sometimes they destroy the barriers to well-being. And as people, as creative people, as designers, and as hopefully sensitive, compassionate people, we can look at how those barriers have been destroyed and perhaps utilize resources that can help people to better meet their needs and perhaps, or differently meet their needs than perhaps they did before. People need hope and a sense of cooperation, a shared direction for their future. And that's something I believe that we can play a part in help creating. Importantly, this hope needs to be realistic. The worst thing you can do, or any of us can do, is to build a sense of false hope, that everything will be exactly as it was before, or everything will be some sort of nirvana. Because dashed hopes are worse than no hopes at all. It is much harder to try and create that sense of hope once people have, for whatever reason, been allowed to have this idea of this better future to set in their minds. But I hope what we can do is we can allow people to go from that post-disaster situation to one where they can access perhaps more and different things than they had before, and to get a sense that that post-disaster future might be a good future, might be something that they're very happy with, and to sort of be able to look to that and invest emotional capital in making it happen. So designing to heal is about ensuring what gets built, the product, the physical manifestation of our work, and the steps along the way the process responds to the unique circumstances of communities overcoming disasters. And when we can do that, I hope we can give people a reason to stay and participate in the rebuilding of their community. And in doing that, this can keep the spark of hope alive and actually cultivate it. This can rebuild social bonds around cooperation and provide a light at the end of the tunnel that isn't an oncoming train. Also, and very importantly, we can give people a way of getting involved in this process when they are ready to do so. One of the main issues that comes from disasters is a sense of disempowerment. And if you allow people to get involved and to sort of like share a common vision that they have and to do their role in making it happen, you are empowering people again and making it their place. Ultimately, that's what it can only succeed if it's their place. It can never be a success if it's something imposed by designers. To do this, it's very important that some things are borne in mind. As designers, as architects, sometimes we get carried away with our own ideas and we think that we're there to sort of rescue people. This is not the case. It shouldn't be the case. We need to show humility. We need to sort of like look on what people have done and how they've overcome what they've done, and to serve them, and not to think of them serving us. We need to accommodate the evolution of plans. Many times people will go through a difficult and convoluted emotional process, and in that time plans will change and the way forward will change, and as long as we can understand that's going to happen, we need to sort of roll with it and be part of that to make sure that each time our response is appropriate for the different stages that people will go through in their recovery process. One thing that I found in nearly everywhere where I've worked is that it's important to be wary of the changing availability and accuracy of information. Accuracy of the information that we have frequently changes, it becomes out of date. It is based on old information that maybe is very different after disasters. If it's physical destruction, knowing what's there and what isn't there can be a big issue. We need to build in mechanisms and ways that we can be responsive to that and change our plans as information comes to light, and to make sure that perfection isn't the enemy of the very good. We'll never get perfect information. We just need to make the process we can at each time. One of the key points that I'd like to say is sometimes, as architects, as designers in any field, there is a tendency towards looking towards the output, getting the building built, getting the road built. That's not the end point. What we should be really interested in is the outcome. What does that facilitate? What does that mean for people? We are building in the social landscape as much as the physical landscape. And that's something we really need to think about. So, in light of a process for undertaking, for designing to heal, don't tell people what to think. It's your job as a designer to advise them that what they might want to think about, to sort of like raise issues for them to draw their own conclusions. It's important as designers, as people who can think about process, about methodology, that we can chart a path to a future that is demonstrably attractive, relevant, and opens up opportunities as they see them, in their terms. So we can give them, as far as we can, a path that has hope along the way and leads them to a place they want to go. Again, I can't stress this enough. We need to make sure the hope that we are cultivating is realistic, and we want to leave people in no doubt about the size of the challenge. We want to make sure that we're being honest in what we tell them, and overcoming disasters will be a big problem. It will be a powerful disruptor to lives on so many levels. We do no one any favours by not acknowledging this. An important part of getting the process right is making sure we have the right influence at the right time. When we set the agenda for design, we want to make sure that the community has overall say in that. Not that we ignore our professional responsibilities. If, as I've seen happen in Christchurch, people were wanting to rebuild car parks very quickly. I think personally to just acknowledge that would have been a bad outcome, because that would have meant that we would be hardwiring places for more vehicle use, and then we make part of a bigger problem. But at the same time, we need to make sure that when we start a project, the agenda that we establish is the community's agenda, and to marry that through good planning and good design, and then use that as our brief. And then in the middle stages of the project, the professionals can focus their creativity and design skills to come up with solutions that respond to the community's agenda, and to make sure that those are realistic, resource efficient, and address that agenda established by the community. And then not to just accept this, but to go back to the community and ask them, have we got it right? In the latter stages of a project, what we want to make sure we do is ensure that the community are empowered to build, use, maintain, and adapt the solutions that we have a hand in helping to make happen. So it becomes their intervention, not ours. We are just working with, not for the community. And at the end of the day, it's something that can become embedded in their social landscape, that they care about, that the resources invested in making it happen make a difference for them in their social landscape. So just to go through some of the features of a process which in my experience has contributed to helping people to heal. Right from the start, architects, designers, any professionals need to be very consultative to demystify the design process, to be clear and transparent, so people feel they know how their contribution is making a difference, and people can see, can be part of making a shared vision for their community. We need to ensure that ideas are accessible, that everything is presented in layman's terms. And this often means using lots of pictures, using lots of pictograms and graphics, so people can see things very clearly and they can see a sense of what ideas mean for them. And I've used here an illustration from the rebuilding process in Christchurch after the earthquake, where they were establishing what the agenda of the community was and what the relative priority of different objectives were. I think it's very clear and very attractive graphic. We need to make sure that anything we suggest, we do so in a promotional way. Not just what is required, but why it is required. We need to check in with participants at each stage to ensure shared understanding. People after disasters, their head is fried, they have difficulty concentrating. Part of the impacts of the allostatic load on their body is not being able to concentrate. And so our checking in and making sure that each of the ideas we're presenting is presented in bite-sized pieces can be helpful to keep people coming, to make sure that the process is being shared by everyone. It's very important we're transparent and we outline a clear process. We have a series of responsibilities to survivors. I like to use words survivors, not victims. Survivors implies an agency, and that's important, I think, for people who are disempowered. As I've mentioned, we need to manage expectations. We need to make sure that we can make the progress that we can at each step, to get runs on the board so people have an early indication that things are getting better, so people can identify that bottom point and on reflection look back on it and see that the point at which hope becomes more realistic and they can more focus on the future than the past. It's important that we identify and nurture common ground. People are often very anxious and angry after disasters. We need to inspire but not take over. Remember, we are there not to lead the recovery, but to serve it, and to help a community of implementation. So what this means is to empower people to all play a part in making things happen. And so it's very important that we, as part of our responsibility to survivors, is that we can help build a community of implementation to empower people to be part of making the changes happen for their community so they can take a role in making it happen. When we get the process right, we can play a good role in setting a path that can help people down their journey to recovery. Participating in and arriving at a plan everyone can agree with is in itself therapeutic. As I've mentioned, the planner Rob Kerr in Kaipoi in New Zealand, in talking about his experience of the earthquakes in Canterbury, was a good plan, well visualised, is worth 1,000 hours of counselling. I heard quotes from people saying about how they used to go to meetings to complain about what was happening, but then they went to meetings to hope what could be happening. Very quickly, I'll run through some typical design characteristics. I know that's not the main point of today's meeting, but I think it's quite helpful to give some context. What we need to do, rather than rely on the big design that most of us are used to, the design that's built and implemented by development companies, by big builders, is to, where possible, provide opportunities for little design, for those projects that community groups can do, they can adorn, they can make happen in their environment, to make these physical manifestations of being part of that process of recovery. This reduces reliance on big capital, on investment in financial capital, and instead relies more on emotional capital. these sorts of projects, and I feature in these slides lots of projects from organisations such as Gap Filler and Greening the Rubble, which are two organisations which came about to help the community be part of the recovery for their own community. Evolutionary, transitionary, but not temporary. Yes, they pass, but the main point is to leave a legacy of positive change. These sorts of projects, small projects that can be effectively done DIY, empower people and tell the community that they can play a role in determining their own future. And if you get the chance, have a look at the websites of Gap Filler and Greening the Rubble, and you'll see many delightful little projects that just speak volumes about how much the community can contribute. Another thing that is essential and is perhaps at the periphery of what we do as designers in the built environment, but we very much need to think about, is how places are managed. It is important that we design them in a way that they can be managed to provide opportunities for full social interaction. Obviously, not so much in the COVID-19 crisis that we're facing, but under other crises where these social bonds have frayed, if we can provide the sorts of opportunities for people to get together, we can enable people to rebuild those social bonds. The picture on the left is from the Netherlands, and it's an idea that's come about there where outside people's houses, and every Sunday during summer, people sit outside people's houses and they become informal outdoor cafes, and people from the community come and gather, and for a donation you can have a coffee, a drink, or because it's Amsterdam, sometimes you can have smokable goods, and these are ways that people can reconnect with other people in their area. On the right, it's a picture from a project called Play Quarters in London, where a series of streets would be closed to traffic, and through no physical intervention at all, apart from barriers at the end of the street, become temporary play streets, which has been well studied and revealed to be very important for enabling people to connect with one another. One of the most important things that we can aspire to do is to enable people to change the way they think about the place. This is a sketch I did of Restart, which was a pop-up mall, let's call it, of shipping containers in Christchurch. The Christchurch city centre had died after the earthquake there, and people were getting used to going elsewhere, and they'd lost meaning that the centre had meant for them. The mall was a very strong way that was theatrically done almost, to get people to reconnect and to make this sort of bridgehead into this area of disaster that provided a very strong magnet for people to come there. The mall was designed and built very quickly. All the containers came in on one ship, and it was treated like a ship relieving a besieged town. And a lot of people will say they will put the point of recovery at when that started. This gave people a sense of hope and of fun, and it put Christchurch on a map in a design sense, which it probably previously hadn't done before that. Each of those containers was a shop or a cafe, and it was very carefully managed with lots of entertainment to draw people in and to give people a manifestation that things were getting better. And this went a long way to changing people's view of what Christchurch was. Another example of that, of making people feel differently, this is something called Dancer Mats, which was a project by Gap Filler, and it was basically a very simple intervention which had a jukebox that you worked by putting in $1 coin into it, and you could sort of like use your whatever iPhone, your electronic device, to play music, and people would get together and, being eccentric Kiwis, do these sort of crazy dances all together. And in doing so, in this somewhat, you might say, silly, frivolous way, they got people to feel differently about a place, to give it meaning, and to sort of have a sense that there was a life beyond that tainted by what had happened to them. Another quality is this idea of what I call polyvalence. And this is a term borrowed from chemistry. It's an ability of something to mean more than one thing at once. The best example, a very powerful example of this, is provided by the 9/11 Memorial Plaza in New York. As you, I'm sure, know, this is on the site of the Twin Towers. And what it does is it recognizes that people have lots of different needs that they need to be met to thrive and to have restorative experiences and overcome the effects of trauma. So what it has done for very many clever ways is it can be a sacred place and a secular place at once. It can provide a place where kids can play and where people can grieve in close proximity to one another, but they can do so in a way that doesn't interfere with each other. You will see on the image on the right, the seats were designed as blocks, and I drew this picture from memory because I felt it was intrusive to take a photo. But what I saw was, people on one block would be engaging a chat, and behind them someone was obviously deep in grief, in trauma, I can't say trauma, in grief, and this could happen in a way because of the people facing different directions and the sense of spacing. That meant that these things didn't interfere with one another. Around the two pools in the centre, as you approached them, you only became aware of the sound of the falling water when you approached it quite closely, and that gave that a different feel. And that meant that central area had this sort of, whether you were looking for it or not, would often have a quite profound impact on people's sense of where they were, of the place where they were visiting. The closer you got to it, the more powerful that got to be. It was, to my mind, when I found out about it, admittedly afterwards, very powerful to realise that when you're inside the last row of trees, you're underneath the footprint of the Twin Towers. And that experience of that knowing that, evoked a very powerful response, which for people wanting to feel that response was very important. But at the same time, I saw kids playing on the grass, and that could happen in a way that was, the two were mutually compatible. In other words, it had this sense of polyvalence, of having multiple meanings. Another quality is this idea of familiarity. When you rebuild, if you want to try and minimize this effects of solastalgia, to try and hang on to some of the aspects of what was there before, you can help people to give a sense of continuation, not of a complete fracture between the past life and the future life. Now, what that familiarity comes from can be varied and can only be established when you talk to the community. It might be in the way a place looks. It might be in the functions it serves. We can't assume we know that. We need to ask people. The pictures show a place in the hills which was destroyed in the bushfires a few years ago, called El Khana. The one on the left was the old building, and the one on the right, the new one. The new building was built to contemporary standards for bushfires, for building for sustainability, but it had enough of the qualities. It served the same function as what was there before, which, from the people I talked to, who had used and visited the centre, was a great comfort to them. And if, as designers, we can look into what aspect of a place mattered to the people who were there, and to try and do what we can to build that into the future, we can help people to go through that process of recovery. Importantly, we need to be guided by the social landscape. Now, what I mean by this is some places, some spaces will have a particular meaning for the community, and that's where we should concentrate our efforts and invest the resources we have available to us. On the screen are two projects I worked with. The one on the left is from Palestine, where a space had a meaning for people. It was a very negative meaning. And through a design process, we changed the meaning of that space so it wasn't a space of accidents, of cars going through it quickly, but had a range of different meanings because we responded to a community. And this was felt to be very important by the people because it was the first time they had been empowered to do anything. Yes, making quality of a space better, providing children's facilities, a place to meet, wasn't the highest on the list of priorities. We didn't present it as such. But it was 101 self-determination. It was the first time in a very long time this community had any say in what was going to happen in their community. And from the post-project assessment was well received. We need to make places sticky. What I mean by this is we need to make shared spaces such that people want to be there. So they're more likely to be there when the next person passes through. And in that way, get that connection between people. But it's important, not just for COVID-19, but generally, we don't force interaction. It's always a choice. It means so much more when it's a choice. It's important that we create places that people can adorn. What I mean by this is that places that are good in their own right, but provide a canvas for people to express themselves. And this can be from their physical manifestations of their expression, or what they do in that space. As Jan Gehl says, man is man's greatest joy. And there's not many spaces that aren't improved by having people in them. And if we can do this, we can help to create a more conducive environment for people to go through their own processes of recovery, in my experience. Just to reiterate the point about providing choice, the worst thing we can do is to narrow down people's own choices. We need to be about opening up choice. I'll use the example of it is a very topical thing about COVID-19. I was discussing with someone yesterday about what's perhaps an appropriate planning and design response. And the idea came up from the person I was talking to that we should try and facilitate more people to travel by car. Cars are more you have more control over isolation. I would say that would be entirely the wrong choice. We need to remember, it's really important to remember, that diseases aren't just spread by being communicable. They're not just spread by contagions like the present virus is. The biggest problem society is facing now in the West, well, maybe not now, but for the last few years, has been non-communicable diseases. And these are made worse by issues like isolation, by issues like not getting enough physical activity. And if we hardwire our built environment to make people more isolated, to make it harder for people to have these physical exercise, we are making that problem worse. And I would very strongly advise that not to, in trying to solve this problem, which needs solving, and it needs us to be isolated, and it needs us to not go out, we don't make ourselves another and perhaps worse problem down the way. So, designing to heal. In essence, it is about responding to new circumstances. It's a different world after disasters. We can't pretend it's the same world. What we need to do is to overlay the bad memories and associations with positive ones to get people to have a sense of a space that matters to them, that can nurture them. We need to help people create and own the places that they can see contributes to their quality of life, that they can self-determine and say, this place matters to me. And if we do that, we can help be a part of making surroundings that will help to provide a stepping stone towards a sense of self-determination, for people to gain control of their own life and to set their own path towards achieving a sense of self-fulfillment. Finally, perhaps we need to, or nearly finally, we need to make sure that we are always working with people, not for them, to change the present sort of relationship that I often see in architecture, planning and design. when we do this, we need to be aware of cultural differences. Everywhere is different. The worst thing we can do is design for the last disaster and respond to a problem which perhaps isn't relevant. If we waste resources that way, that's something that I think we can avoid and should avoid. Don't be hamstrung waiting for all the information and help. We're never going to get it. It's good to start with whatever you have and to do what you can in the meantime, because that way you can begin to get rounds on the board. As we'll hear shortly, there will be anger, there will be distress, there will be disengagement. People will find it difficult to engage. But if we're there for people when they're ready to engage, we can help. We need to respect the uniqueness of their experience. The worst thing we can do is to say that we've had that experience. We haven't. We need to be aware of what that experience was as far as we can, to respect it, but not to pretend we share it. People go through different phases of recovery, and in doing so, their perspectives will change, and we just need to accommodate that. Also, and this is, I hope, very important as well, we need to be very careful before just giving it a go. People get called to work in disaster projects, and I've seen many buildings, beautiful buildings under other circumstances, many spaces, which have just failed completely because they haven't responded to the post-disaster situation. They were done by well-meaning designers, well-meaning architects who put in a lot of effort to addressing a problem, but the problem they addressed wasn't the right one. And this, I think, is something that we should all be aware of. So, thank you very much.